Hey everyone, welcome back to the What is Money show. I am sitting down again today with my friend codenamed Lester, and we're going to continue our journey into this excellent book by Palyi, The Twilight of Gold. But I thought, we were talking offline a little bit that maybe we'd start with some questions you had actually about the Snyder series, the series I did with Jeff Snyder, rather.
Yeah. I just want to mention this is one small correction from last time we were talking. I was talking about the period of bank restriction of the Bank of England. I think I got the dates wrong. The actual period was 1797 to 1819. In case I got those dates wrong, I'd look that up. You and Snyder got into a really, really productive vein about the public's ability to intervene as an information filter versus the central bank and the Committee of Central Bankers being the final arbiters of monetary policy. And it really relates back to this book and to a lot of revelations I've had about the value of Bitcoin. There's a quote from this book. Palyi pulls from Montague Norman's personal letters. Montague Norman was the governor of the Bank of England during a lot of the critical episodes that we're talking about. And he wrote to another central banker that it must surely be the concern of all to avoid, so far as possible, disturbing fluctuations in the value of gold. I do not believe that gold in circulation can safely be regarded as a reserve that can be made available in case of need. And I think even in times of abundance, hoarding is bad because it weakens the command of the central bank over the monetary circulation and hence over the purchasing power of the monetary unit. Palyi in the book, he italicizes the last clause, and I sort of punched it with my delivery, but it weakens the command of the central bank over monetary circulation. And there's a line from Rothbard, which isn't necessarily about money specifically, but he writes that it's clear that the greater the proportion of old stock to new production, meaning if there's a larger ratio, if the old stock is larger in the ratio of new production, then the greater will tend to be the importance of the supply of the old possessors compared to that of the new producers. The tendency will be for old stock to become more important, the greater the durability of the good. Well, like looking at these two quotes side by side, the possessors of the old stock then become the ultimate information filter, and the possessors of the old stock, I'm sort of combining wording from these two quotes, the possessors of the old stock take command over the monetary circulation and hence over the purchasing power of the monetary unit. And so Bitcoin is the first money where the possessors of the old stock dictate the purchasing power of the unit, not the manufacturers of the new stock. And that is kind of the whole point. It's a mind-blowing point. And it's an ability that it has been the project of governments and central bankers for 100 years to take that away from the possessors of the old stock. And Bitcoin gives it back to them. So your Snyder quote made me think of all that.
I'm actually struggling to get my head around this. So making the case that gold in circulation cannot be made available as it weakens the command of the central bank. And then the second quote is saying that basically the holders of the old money, I guess, then have disproportionate influence on the purchasing power.
Well, think of the Rothbard quote, not in terms of money, but in terms of any good, any commodity or any good.
Okay.
So if the old stock is the majority of what exists in the market, and his caveat is the greater the durability of the good, then the following is true, which is that the greater the proportion of old stock to new production, meaning the higher the stock to flow ratio. I mean, that's what he's talking about.
Yep.
The higher the stock to flow ratio, the greater the durability of the good, then the tendency will be for the old stock to be more important in terms of determining the purchasing power of the good, whatever the good is.
Right.
And Bitcoin is the most durable, it's information. So it's the most durable good ever created. So assuming infinite durability and an infinite stock to flow ratio, it means that the possessors have the ultimate ability to filter and intervene and dictate the pricing of the good. And the people who create the new units have almost no ability to dictate the pricing.
Wow. So this is the ultimate land grab, effectively.
Totally.
Because, the quicker you acquire territory or sit down at this game of musical chairs, if you want to use that analogy, like the more it's a race, right? You benefit, like that's the goal of the race, actually, is to take as much territory as possible.
And hold it. And the only corollary is to hold it. And,
yes.
That's something I struggle with a lot, is I just compulsively acquire Bitcoin whenever I can. I think sometimes to my own detriment. I think the goal is to make it to the other side of whatever this temporary, if we're at the end of like a 100-year credit cycle, if we're at the end of the US dollar, the reserve currency, and if we're headed towards a dollar inflation, then whether you think that the central bank is capable of producing inflation or not, no matter what you think, what we are in store for is volatility. Mm-hmm. And the goal is to make it to the other side of that. And I don't know that I'm like good at strategically thinking about that, but I do think that that whether I make it or not, the goal is to have as much Bitcoin as possible, because whoever holds it and it's spread out. I mean, it's spread out among a lot more people than there are central bankers. And so it's just the largest cohort is determining the purchasing power of that money.
Yeah. The stock to flow thing has gotten slightly beat up, I think, in Bitcoin circles in relation to the price modeling and projecting and all of that. But the quotes you're laying out here, they revisit really the essential nature of stocks and flows. And I encourage anyone that hasn't read about systems theory or systems thinking. I think there's actually a book called Thinking in Systems that describes how all complex systems are effectively stocks and flows, right? We're mapping this, if reality is just all of these different patterns interacting with one another, the best way to detangle the complexity is to evaluate them through this lens of stocks and flows, like what is static and what is dynamic, and what are the feedback loops. And it seems to me, like in the case of gold, that it is something that is what caused gold to become money. It was the most stable or predictable or unchangeable, immutable substance we could use, basically. And I think that framing is very useful for evaluating Bitcoin as something it's taken the properties that gold approximated and effectively perfected them. Like you mentioned durability. I've laid out the other monetary properties, but I think, and just to put a button on it, it's like systems thinking. This is probably the most sophisticated form of thinking we have as a species. I mean, this is looking at the world and the universe and reality as a complex system. And recognizing that everything influences everything else. So whatever is least influenced becomes like the safe strategy, or the Schelling point, if you will. Mm-hmm. So
least influenced could be another good property of money. Mm-hmm. I think that the stock to flow, I think stock to flow is just incredibly important. And I think you can't put too much emphasis on the plan B pricing model, but I think that pricing model, if you don't take it literally, I think it expresses a deep fundamental truth, not necessarily of Bitcoin, but there's a reason why it applies to roughly gold and Bitcoin and diamonds and silver, I think that curve, that the basic shape of that curve is actually a threshold test, that if a good or a commodity in the minds of the public qualifies as a money, then it roughly falls into the shape of that curve.
Mm-hmm.
And if a good or a unit of something doesn't like just pass that test deeply psychologically as money, then it's just not going to obey that curve.
Yeah, and that's exactly what fiat is doing, right? It violates the curve.
Yeah, totally. Totally. So then I just want to also, I don't know if you're listening, I don't know if you picked up on something that I was sort of reflecting on, thinking back to what we've talked about so far, but there's somewhat of a inherent contradiction that's going to get even more pronounced the more we get into the underlying mechanism of the gold standard, which is that on the one hand, as I said in the very beginning, the gold standard was effectively the sterling standard, and the British dominated the sterling standard for their own gain. That's how they survived. That was like their main export, was controlling the gold standard through the sterling standard. And at the same time, the gold standard was a universal standard that enforced discipline, and then these extremely dynamic trading conditions internationally that were competitive, and there was wage and price flexibility. There was an international specialization, an international, Palyi's got a term for it. The, well, now I've forgotten this term, but it was the international specialization of labor. And so you have this like international system, and then the system that's dominated by the British. Those things seem to be in contradiction with one another. And I think that is actually true, but both are true. They are in contradiction, and they are both true at the same time. I think the gold standard was like this force that the English harnessed for their own benefit. But the point is that it could just as easily have been enforced from multiple market centers and not just one single dominant center. Mm-hmm. And Palyi addresses this specifically in the book, and he actually uses the word decentralized. He's writing this in 1968, late 60s, that the gold standard could have functioned in a decentralized manner as long as credit flows freely between markets and is reactive to interest rate and exchange rate differentials. And so it's smoothing those out by capital flowing back and forth. So the gold standard does not require one sovereign entity to control it. It just grew up that way for a lot of reasons, a lot of idiomatic reasons that the deposit banking evolved in England and didn't evolve in other countries. You know, there was gold in other countries, but people just didn't deposit it at banks. So there's nowhere to go to borrow it. And so the English just happened to develop this system. But if you're feeling like that there's a contradiction, you're right. That is something of a contradiction, but I think it's a contradiction that is a productive contradiction that just worked. And it ultimately is actually why the Bank of England, why they failed ultimately in 1931. So we just wanted to highlight that in case anyone's picked up on it. And
that's useful. Just to jump in on that. So the idiomatic reasons really are the technological, what I often call the technological realities of gold, right? It's not portable, frankly. So it makes sense that we introduced an institution to augment that. That's effectively what the bank is, right? It's like, let's put all the gold in one place. We'll abstract that gold into a paper token, and then we'll trade the token. Everyone has a call option via the token to get the gold anytime. So that coheres a Schelling point, frankly, like a game theoretic dynamic equilibrium. What is the contradiction then is that although we coalesced around one money, we don't need one central authority to facilitate that standard. Is that what you're getting at?
I think the contradiction is that it's this universal standard that enforces discipline and creates like a really healthy, there is no one winner, international competition, like trade competition. It's truly a system that is governed by like natural law and puts everyone on an equal playing field, and yet was dominated and controlled by one country.
Right.
That's the contradiction.
Yeah. And again, back to the physicality, right? It's because violence works to extract gold that has this, it creates incentives basically to be an imperialist.
Yeah. I mean, there's a tangent there, but I think another reason that England was able to hold on to at least the contention of another writer, Marcello De Chico, in his book Money and Empire, is his contention is that England was actually able to hold on to their advantage because they subjugated India and forced India to take all of their exports, even though they lost international share to other highly productive countries. They were managed to sort of exploit the entire continent of India to take their outdated goods and for India to store their gold with the Bank of England. And it was the subjugation of that continent, which gave England another advantage for another extra, I don't know, 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Britain effectively, clearly they colonized India, and then economically subjugated them. Did that mean gold was flowing out of India into Britain during that time?
Yeah.
I guess both forcibly and via market mechanisms then.
Yeah. I only read one book on it, and it's not the entire book, but it was, seems like Brits were put in charge of all of the major economic institutions in India when they were a colony. And so all of their reserves, they held English banking reserves, and then their gold they didn't hold their own gold.
Right.
And they were like a resource extractive country that England took the benefits of those resources and then forced, I don't know exactly if it was the point of a gun, but essentially forced India to buy British manufactured goods.
Right.
Even though they weren't the best goods on the market anymore.
Right. That's very interesting. Because, so you mentioned that the Brits put themselves in charge of Indian economic institutions. And I think that, there's a cultural obsession with gold in India. And I can't help but think that is an echo of this game being played, right?
It's interesting. I wonder. I do wonder. I hadn't put those two things together. There's another thing, which is that in 1970, the Bank of France suspended specie payments for paper currency. And so like, because the other major center of gold, like sort of bowed out of the game, suddenly England really had control. If you wanted bullion, you had to go to England. So they're kind of given this monopoly. And because they're given this monopoly, it was like in their best interest to maintain the price of gold, like to maintain the best way for them to do it was to hoard as much of it as possible so that they could dictate the price of it when they wanted to serve their benefit. So again, like this theme that we've touched on a bunch of times, which is that I think that the effect of price stability is to benefit the person who's in control of the money. That's like the ultimate manifestation of price stability is it gives a tremendous advantage to the person who's like holding on to the hoard.
Yeah, this is contrary to central bank induced price stability. This would be more like naturally emergent price stability, in that when a money that emerges naturally has the least variant supply, like of course other things become priced in it, which as its liquidity, by definition, almost as money is the most liquid or most marketable asset, prices denominated in a naturally emergent money will naturally be the most stable available, but it doesn't mean they'll ever be fixed.
Right. And I think actually I've been thinking about, you and I have been messaging about this for a while. I've been trying to think for last couple of years, does price stability exist in nature? And we've touched on a couple times in this conversation, and I would say no.
Yeah.
I actually think that the most stable price force we have in the universe right now, and this someone else tweeted this, I'd have to find it. It was an expression of my thought, but I didn't come up with the wording, but it is hashes per kilowatt per sat is perhaps the most stable pricing force on the planet in nature at this moment. And it's kind of the only metric you really need to think about.
So
hashes per
kilowatt.
joule or per kilowatt, per Satoshi, per second. I think you have to add another per in there. Hashes per second, per kilowatt hour, per Satoshi.
I'm doing the decimal in my mind now. It's like, whoa, that's okay. Can you unpack that a little bit? That's interesting, but I think there's some unpacking there.
Well, like, the number of hashes that you get per kilowatt hour has been sort of leveling off. And that is not inherently a stable number, but it has been becoming more stable. Just because we're reaching like a terminus in terms of how efficient ASICs can get now that we're at, 100 plus terahash machines. And so the number of hashes, I mean, the whole game of mining is I want to get more hashes than the next person, but with the exact same amount of electricity. Mm-hmm. So that's the game, is hashes per kilowatt, which are really measured in hashes per kilowatt per second, because it's time based. It's not like how many hashes forever, period. You don't stop. So you're competing every second with other miners. So it's hashes per second per kilowatt. And that is just like microprocessors being, I don't want to repeat myself because I know we touched on this briefly before, but like microprocessors being the most complex machine that civilization makes, like we're at the limit. And then we're also at the lower bound of the price of electricity. Like we found the cheapest electricity. And so the cost, so you have hashes per second, per kilowatt, per sat, is like something that is constantly being maxed out. And then if like say half the hash power drops off the globe, well then there's a self-correcting mechanism where the difficulty goes down. And so that number like immediately returns to its most maximum efficient number, because the difficulty goes down. And so the productivity of the remaining hash power actually remains almost exactly the same. And if you wanted to create sort of like a monetary pricing unit that captured the greatest stability that exists, where the complexity and the productive capacity of civilization intersects with the natural world, but had some sort of quote unquote stability, it actually would either be the Bitcoin price itself, or it would be a pricing unit that is an expression of hashes per kilowatt hour per second per sat, because that actually will be the stablest thing. If you could make a multiple out of hashes per kilowatt hour per second and divided it by the number of sats in existence, you would actually, I think, get like a number that is moving on a trend, but is on a continuous and kind of stable trend, and is actually the only sort of stable pricing mechanism we have in nature.
It's, I don't want to, this word profound gets thrown around a lot, but that seems quite profound to me. It's almost like a measure of the Darwinian competition per unit of energy, per unit of time, something like that. It's like a pure measure of work or force or Wow, that's very interesting.
And
So,
there is room for feedback. The feedback on the value of Bitcoin actually, the amount, you could say, well, how does it's independent of the dollar price or the fiat price of Bitcoin, but it's not, because the higher the fiat price of Bitcoin, the more that society's resources go into making microprocessors. And so, microprocessors are like an index on the productive capacity of what we can do. And the higher the price, the more those get built specifically for Bitcoin. And so you get more hashes per kilowatt hour per second. So I don't know. I've always felt like there's if there was a really robust market for hash rate based derivatives, it actually might become a stable pricing unit for the future.
Yeah.
Because Bitcoin really does swing a lot based on demand.
Yeah.
And this is actually a concept for pricing that just doesn't change very much because of Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I haven't looked at this in a while, but when I looked at hash rate derivatives, this was probably a year ago. I think hash rate was like 3x the vol of Bitcoin spot. It's extremely volatile. And an issue faced by miners is that they can lock in long-term power purchase agreements, long-term cost curves effectively. But to really get this to get Bitcoin mining to the level of utility level investment flows, it needs to stabilize its revenue curve as well. So it needs a mature derivatives market for hash, basically. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you make a spreadsheet for yourself and you map out what you think is the compound annual growth rate of hash rate, and then what's the growth rate of Bitcoin's price. So if hash rate's going up, then your yield on your miner is going down. So they work, they balance each other.
Yeah.
So I made the spreadsheet, so I was looking at the economics of mining, and I'd been working on this spreadsheet for a couple of weeks, and it never occurred to me to try to input the same number. What if the hash rate grows at the exact same rate as the Bitcoin price? And so I had these payouts. I had 3 years of payouts in separate fields cascading down for the next 3 years, monthly payouts. And then I input the CAGR of hash rate, and then the same growth rate for Bitcoin price, meaning they cancel each other out. And then all the columns updated, and they were the same in dollar terms. Now, my yield was continually going down for 3 years. So that number is decreasing, and the price of Bitcoin is going up at the same rate. Your actual yield in dollar terms stays completely constant. And I was that was such a mind-blowing thing. That's the whole, I'm seeing an expression of mining economics right now. If those grow hand in hand, then in dollar terms, they're completely stable.
I'd love to see that spreadsheet.
I'll show it to you. It's so cool.
It's incredible.
Okay, so this is actually an appropriate transition to the theme of today, which is that humans, I think, have been obsessed with automaticity. This is one of the themes we mentioned at the top of this whole topic. And we have attempted with our money different really impressive forms of automatic adjustment mechanisms. Bitcoin is the latest, and I think the greatest, but all of these forms have broken in the past. And in a way, I think that this, looking backwards and looking at this book, is the best prism with which to look forward. It has revealed so many truths to me. And I think that we're drawn to the idea of removing discretion and therefore automaticity. But I feel like as Bitcoiners, we have to take special note of our desire for this. And again, of this Tocqueville quote that institutions depend on the mind of those that run them, not the laws by which they're regulated. And this is true of Bitcoin as well. And we can't fool ourselves into thinking that Bitcoin is just so radical that it's immune from being overwritten by crisis.
Right. Yeah, that's a kind of a chilling quote in a way, if you really consider its implications.
Yeah.
And that's actually one thing that Bitcoin, I don't want to say overcomes, but it has a strong check against, right? That we've actually, again, this term shelling point gets thrown around, but it's like I talked to Lowry yesterday, so I guess that's why I'm using it so much today. The idea that we can align individual self-interest with the collective social institution, right? So the actual laws, this is like the consent of the governed type of thing that's embedded in the US Constitution, that the incentives need to be properly aligned at the individual and the collective level. Otherwise, those that run the institution will bend those rules to favor their individual selves at the expense of those who cannot bend the rules. And Bitcoin seemingly has a very strong check against that, right? If you try to, basically I get to select what rules I'm going to abide by running my own node. And there's a strong center of gravity in a game theoretic sense, in that the rules people are running on Bitcoin Core all favor the individual, right? Can't confiscate it, can't counterfeit it, hard cap, etc. I've probably read this quote before. I read it. It's one of my favorite quotes, but it's just so, in terms of this, I hope I can pronounce this right. Automaticity. Mm-hmm. It seems like a universal impulse, almost like it's pre-human life, even like it almost is the algorithm of evolution itself, is nature's just trying to economize in a way. And so I'll read this Whitehead quote. He says, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations we can perform without thinking of them. And that's by Alfred North Whitehead. And in my mind, like, therein lies the economic value of ritualization, institutionalization, and automation. And so this impulse that you described towards greater automaticity, it's very deep, right? It's like from a unicellular organism forward, we've been trying to automate these processes of life, cooperation, competition, et cetera.
And I think that it is, we crave it. We crave it in our money, especially, and we haven't been able to achieve it yet. Every system we've designed, and we've, the gold standard was the most elaborate and had some really impressive automaticity built into it, but it got broken also. And I see those weaknesses in Bitcoin, and I've been trying to talk about them more with Bitcoiners, and it sometimes comes off as maybe me fear-mongering or fudding. I'm saying this as someone who is 100% Bitcoin. I'm telling you, I see the possibility for the rules to be changed. I see that as a real problem. And I think, and I say it because I would love to be able to help inoculate the system against it. But I don't think Bitcoiners can ever assume that the Bitcoin is just so powerful, and that the program is so strong, and the protocol is so well dispersed that it's immune. It's a human institution, and humans can change it. And we have to instill some sense of orthodoxy among the holders that outlasts us, or else that will be changed as well.
Hey, everybody. As you've no doubt learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to get Bitcoin into the hands of as many people as possible. One of the ways they are accomplishing this mission is by empowering banks and financial technology companies to offer their own Bitcoin products and services. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and has quickly become a leader in this space. So, whether you are a professional investor looking for asset management services or a company looking to white label your own Bitcoin product or service, consider NYDIG your single source solution for everything Bitcoin. Yeah, the back to the automaticity thing, we crave it even in our households, right?
Yeah.
You've got, some young ones running around. I do as well, to try and establish that daily routine and just the flow of actions that need to happen to get people where they want to go or need to go. Mm-hmm. It's a constant struggle, and that's kind of the microcosm of the socioeconomic macrocosm, that we need dependable protocols, right, through which to interact, that we can solve these recurrent problems we have. A big one being just the economic problem itself, right? We all want more, but resources are finite. So how do we get the most bang for the buck? And that, it's interesting because we're craving the very thing that solves it, but there's also this weird temptation. Like when you create the institution that economizes human action, the people that govern that institution, back to your quote, it depends on the minds of those governors. Well, those governors are now in a position to abuse their power effectively. So it's this weird, like, yin yang situation we've been caught in. And it seems like Bitcoin is a level up of some kind, right? Like it's a new social institution that people can't as easily corrupt.
Because the ability to alter the rules is what allows a group to stay in power.
Exactly.
Any group's refusal to yield power is where these rule changes come from. And so if we have built a system where you cannot contravene the rule set, then we will see regime changes, because people just won't be qualified holders of Bitcoin.
Right.
And if they can't make more to stay in power, then they will not.
100%. And then, so inflation itself is a violation of the rule of law, really.
Yeah.
And to protect Bitcoin from that, to your point, like, the tech is there, but we have to go beyond that. We have to have an orthodoxy, as you said.
Yeah, because, we're talking about the economics of miners. I see a very credible threat from the mining industry in the future, just because you look at all of the capital. I'm joining that force right now. I'm putting capital into putting some miners online. And again, you just stare at that issuance chart. You look at, it's the year 2139, and you have $1 billion of miners out there, or I don't know what the denomination will be in the year 2139. You have 1 trillion flarsecs, or whatever the money is going to be then. And you're like, oh, and the reward is 1 sat per block. And in this whole 4-year halving epoch, there's going to be 210,000 sats total. I would support changing the issuance rate to make my miners more profitable for the next 100 years. I don't know why miners wouldn't support that. If the transaction, if transactions aren't paying for that entire industry. So I just think, like, we have to, you have to, I would just watch it. I just be very wary of that in the future.
Yeah, it's complicated.
It is complicated. It's the most complicated discussion we have in Bitcoin. And I think it's the threat that I see as, like, I think if we break the 21 million cap, I think Bitcoin's over.
Agreed.
I just think it's over in the same way that when Britain finally formally devalued the pound in 1931, that was it. That was a sign that Britain was it. They were done.
Yeah.
In the same way, if we let go of that, Bitcoin's done.
Yeah, agreed. 21 million is almost like the religious motif of Bitcoin to some extent. If you break that, you've opened Pandora's box.
Mm-hmm. As long as you have people who are willing to run their own nodes, then no matter who wants to fork off into something else, you can always keep the 21 million chain going.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe some very powerful exchanges won't call it Bitcoin. I think there's a lot of forces. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's a ton of forces that can't align against Bitcoin. And I'm just trying to like keep that idea alive, because I think to get cocky is to discount the threats we might face in the future, especially when faced with a deflationary crisis. Because the overwhelming power of the entity in charge is to change the rules to stay in power. There's been this debate in the macro community for forever, but especially in the last 2 years, deflation or inflation, which is it? And it's a false argument. They are totally, those are two forces that are forever interlinked in sequence. Deflation is the natural order of things, either because technology is so deflationary, a la the Jeff Booth hypothesis, or because credit always has to unwind if there's a fixed money supply at the core of it. And so because there will always be these credit bubbles bursting, there will always be deflation. And then inflation is always the policy response from the people in charge. That's just always deflation, then a inflationary impulse, then deflation, then an inflationary impulse. They're just tied together.
Yes, and specifically referring to inflation of the money supply, and when the credit bubbles burst, deflation of that money supply. And this is an important point. Credit, which is one side of the coin of debt, right? You're either the borrower or the creditor. That is money supply, right? When I extend you a loan, we have increased the money supply effectively. And I want to read, we read this quote, I think offline earlier, but you and I were having quite the discussion on inflation, deflation, how to position, et cetera. And as just a testament, I think, to Thomas Jefferson's foresight, written in this, I think this quote's from 17 or 1800s, and what we are actually witnessing today. I would just like to read this quote that I shared with you earlier. Jefferson wrote, quote, "If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered."
That's the most modern quote I have ever heard. That has way more import and relevance right now than anything on Twitter. That is a fully prescient. He just summed it up. That is the problem. And we're living through this. We are living through the true psychological terror of a period between regimes. And the psychological terror is that the fear of deflation and inflation at the exact same time. That is when you see these debates, is it one or the other? No, it's both. And that's the problem. It makes everyone crazy. I just was talking to a friend yesterday, and he's like, I had he's retired. And he's like, man, I had $1 million in the stock market, and I was like, I should sell some, but then it went up, and I was like, I'm screwed if I sell it, and I'm screwed if I don't sell it. You don't know what to do.
Yeah, and this psychological terror is what everyone's navigating, attempting to trim the cells according to what they believe to be their own self-interest. And that's what drives people towards a shelling point. Ultimately, it's like you end up in something like Bitcoin because you're like, okay, if there's arbitrary fiat currency supply inflation, great. I'm in a money nobody can inflate. If there's deflation, although I could be hurt in terms of purchasing power in the short term, right? These deflationary shocks, these credit bubbles bursting, the human response. Like, what do we do every time there's a deflationary shock? within the purview of the central bank is we inflate, we resort to increasingly exotic policy measures to create new forms of reflation, I guess you could say. So Bitcoin is almost like this protection from both types of psychological terror.
Yeah, and by the way, no one can arbitrarily deflate the supply of Bitcoin either.
Mm-hmm.
That's not talked about very much, but it's right. Immune from both.
It's important, yeah.
But I think that it's incumbent upon us as like, if we're going to have to be very creative and think of an entirely new model for the economy, or else it's going to be, or else we're just going to end up with fiat currencies that exist alongside Bitcoin, and then these credit boom and bust periods, because you're right. It is the loaning of money. It is the creation of credit, which is actually the source of inflation. Mm-hmm. And then, and those always lead to panics and then booms, and we'll just have to live with them. And the reason why we live with them now is that, I mean, the reason why everyone's like on such a hamster wheel is that we're all overburdened by debt, and it is the price of our future debt that we're servicing. Mm-hmm. And so we can't afford for our salaries to go down to nominal terms because we have to service our debt. But if we didn't have debt, then we could afford for our salary to go down as long as we were getting wealthier in real terms. I mean, imagine a Bitcoin world. Imagine where you start a new job and your contract, you negotiate at the start for your salary decreases. Your employer has to come to you every 3 years and negotiate for your salary decrease, because Bitcoin is becoming more valuable, and they of course can't afford to pay you the same amount in Bitcoin, and you accept the salary decrease because you know that in real terms you're actually still getting wealthier. Can you imagine that world?
That's crazy. Yeah, it's very interesting. It seems more likely to me that the nature of employment is going to change fundamentally. The sovereign individual goes into this a bit, where in the digital age, everyone effectively becomes their own enterprise, or everyone's perpetual free agent, if you will, right? They analogize it to Hollywood, actually, that a group of contractors come together, around a project, they produce a film, and then they disband and go on, separate to go assemble themselves around other projects. There's not like this fixed long-term employment contract. Now, clearly that varies by industry, but it seems like with all of the liberation enabled in the digital age, that work will be more like that. Just it'll be more project-based versus long-term company-based.
Right. And your business model essentially for every individual is a growing equity share in the life of projects you've worked in. Yeah. And so every job, maybe it doesn't pay at all. Maybe everything you do in your whole life is entrepreneurial, but then you get an equity share of its proceeds into retirement. And so by the time you're, later in your productive years, you have like a trickle of income that is the income from the life share of your life's work. I think that's interesting model.
And well, this also speaks back to just gold or hard money or Bitcoin world, like that. To hold hard money is to effectively hold an equity share in all of the projects and all of the productivity and all the enterprises ever undertaken by human beings up to that point, right? That's what the purchasing power of the money is. It's like whatever the aggregate output of this economy is, I have some fixed share of the call option pool on it, something like that.
Well, you just nailed like why the being part of the Bitcoin economy is why it's spread so fast. Because if you're in Bitcoin, you are incentivized to give away all of your knowledge for free to enrich every other holder of Bitcoin.
Right.
Because if the more people that share that knowledge, you get paid directly by the protocol for having made everyone smarter.
Yes.
Whereas if you are, any talking head or advisor or someone being interviewed in the fiat world, they're all trying to funnel you to like their paid newsletter or their paid service. Why? Because the system that they specialize in robs them for their time. And the only way they can make ends meet is to make you pay them directly, because they're all of their life's energy is being siphoned away. But Bitcoin pays you directly to improve. So the more you make society wealthier, if you just extrapolate that out, the more you work to make society wealthier, you get paid back directly in the value of the money that you already hold.
It's incredible. And this is speaking resoundingly to the importance of properly aligned incentives, because in Bitcoin, effectively, I think what you're saying and what I'm understanding here is the richer the world gets, the richer you get.
Yeah.
And fiat's the reverse, right? It's like kind of the Jeff Booth thesis, like the richer the world gets, well, to maintain inflation and this implicit default via inflation, you now have to expand the money supply even more, right? You can't let prices decline. Otherwise, it just crushes the debt structure.
It scares me. The shape of the debt structure, and that scares me. Understanding how it works still scares me. I still really struggle to understand how it works, and then the ability to really clearly envision how it will work with Bitcoin in the future, given that I think that credit and debt will always exist. How will that work? I'm still really, I don't know. I don't have a clear vision on it.
Yeah, agreed. This whole idea of, gold as money is really premised on the concept of final settlement, which we could say is like the transfer of equity, right? The transfer of absolute ownership with no liability attached to it. But again, that was expensive to do with gold because of gold's physicality. Like it all comes back to gold's physicality, all its drawbacks, which Bitcoin obviously solves. And then to augment gold's limited transactability, we then needed to establish frankly, deferred settlement. So instead of final settlement, we have deferred settlement. But that comes with all these adverse situations in regards to counterparty risk and trust and corruption, et cetera. So maybe we could talk about the importance of final settlement.
Yeah, it's like, why? I guess like it seems intuitively obvious why you'd have a money that you can't change. We've talked about like sort of like the power implications, but it's sort of worth asking the obvious question, like why have a final settlement mechanism that you can't change? What's the point of it? And I feel like you explored some of the more prosaic aspects of this in Tyranny of Time Scarcity. I mentioned that essay a lot because it really impacted me. But it's a gold essentially is a contract with your counterparty in the future, or as a term I found from another good book, a pre-commitment mechanism. And I'll just share this passage. It's from a book called Gold in the Modern World Economy. Assume that the monetary authority has announced at the beginning of the year a rate of monetary growth consistent with zero inflation. Assume further that the population believes the announcement, and that announcement is incorporated into the wage, bargaining, and other contracts that are binding over the whole year. In this circumstance, the authorities, in the absence of a pre-commitment mechanism, knowing that workers believe their stated intentions and have already made their contracts, they now have an incentive to create a monetary surprise, which is to follow an expansionary monetary policy to either reduce unemployment or stimulate the economy or to capture seigniorage revenue. However, the workers with rational expectations will take account of the government's actions and their behavior in the next year when the new contracts are formed, and they will demand higher wages and prices. And this will in turn lead to higher inflation and then eventually return basically to the original level because all the benefits are gone. And then that will then we'll sort of level off back where we were. So I'm going to pause. There's like one line in this quote. Sometimes I pull quotes with lines that I don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
We go to the last line. a credible pre-commitment mechanism, such as a rule that prevents the authorities from altering the monetary growth from its pre-announced path by preventing the government from cheating, can preserve long-term price stability. So like now we've encountered this concept of price stability in a way that I understand and is favorable. It's like, I've negotiated a contract. I want to know it's going to be worth the same amount in terms of the equity of society's production, and that so no one can cheat in the meantime. Contracts are like the fundamental element of business. And if you want to enter into a forward-looking contract, you need to know that the price of the payment's going to be just as valuable, and that it isn't going to be diluted to your detriment in the meantime. That to me is the business, and business, like the entrepreneur's calculation. Entrepreneurs require this calculation to make their judgments about the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. I just spoke with the author of a book called The Brain yesterday. His name is David Eagleman.
Mm-hmm.
And Preston Pish and I did a series on the book, The Brain, but in his book, he talks about a Ulysses contract, which, Ulysses was the guy that tied himself to the mast,
Mm-hmm.
so he wouldn't give in to the temptation of siren song. So there's this is almost like the trick to civilization in a way, that we need to be able to create mechanisms in the present that bind our future selves to, rationally decided actions. And again, at the micro level, again, he was talking about this at the individual level in terms of the brain. It's like to have a gym buddy or something, right? Where Wednesday morning you wake up, you don't want to go to the gym, but if you've got a friend that you've committed to meet there at 10 a.m., then you're much more likely to follow through, given that accountability mechanism. And in the socioeconomic sphere, it seems like we're kind of doing the opposite right now. Like every time there's a problem, we effectively break commitment to the integrity of the dollar. It's like, oh, there's economic turmoil, we'll just print more money. So it's a constant abdication. Whereas Bitcoin, I mean, maybe this is a useful framing, maybe I'm stretching the analogy here, but it's kind of like the ultimate Ulysses contract, in that we're committed to this, right? We're committed to a fixed money supply. So we can't just print money, which is, we know, short-term temporary stimulant effect on spending, investment, et cetera, but it creates long-term consequences. It's very much like a drug. It's like we incur an injury and then we're taking this analgesic, but the analgesic has some side effects longer term side effects that we're ignoring. But Bitcoin kind of gets us off of that path. And it's like, no, you need to actually deal with the problems as they come up. You can't just paper over them.
I mean, the biggest, I think, like one of the biggest defaults in all of monetary history was the abrogation of the gold clause in when Roosevelt took office and devalued the dollar. Well, all of these, it was sort of boilerplate at that time to denominate contracts in gold. Say, okay, well, here's what you have to pay me, and it has to be worth this much in gold. That was like in most contracts. Mm-hmm. And so this went to the Supreme Court after Roosevelt devalued the gold, because people were like, well, then pay me in gold. And the Supreme Court, this is actually really interesting. The Supreme Court upheld the policy of devaluing the dollar, but it didn't give Congress the ability to nullify all those contracts. But that was the net effect, was that Congress has the ability to nullify every business contract in existence. Not they're between parties that didn't involve the government.
Right.
The gold clause in all contracts was then nullified. Well, that sucks, because that's that was the point of that clause. That's why it was in there.
It's just like the relationships lose integrity. I'm struggling to how to phrase this. There's this threat of force frankly, from on high that then disintegrates all of the commercial relationships that don't even involve the
Right.
source of the threat at all.
Right.
But
Right.
that,
Totally outside of it.
yeah, it's really bad. I don't know, like how you just,
It's the total abandonment of property rights. It's a total
yes,
destruction of property rights.
exactly. And property rights are the bedrock of civilization.
Gold was this like incontrovertible hold your feet to the fire system, but we as a society, because of the centralization of gold, developed these contingency clauses that allowed governments like special powers to circumvent the rules.
Right.
And the original contingency clause was war.
Right.
And in wartime, governments could suspend convertibility.
Right.
And the rule worked because people understood, like, well, this war is an existential threat. And we know that once the war is over, there will be like a slight period of adjustment, but the government's going to have to follow a deflationary policy to resume payments at the original rate. So this gets back to convertibility being the ultimate check.
Right.
If society is going to demand that at some point the money has to be convertible at the old rate, then the government must pay for what they've done with deflationary policy at some point. And so in that way, the gold standard, the convertibility standard directly incentivized war by giving governments this contingency clause. Right. And then the contingencies started to expand. Well, okay, so we all understand. I mean, and by the way, governments like adhered to this for a long time. Like, coming out of the Napoleonic War, the British held the price of gold for 200 years. They actually were able to use the contingency and then back out. But now look where we are. Well, okay, a banking crisis, does that qualify as a contingency? Okay, a pandemic, does that qualify as a contingency? Seems like everything qualifies as a contingency now. So there's no pre-commitment mechanism. There's no commitment mechanism. And it leaves people feeling really adrift financially.
Yeah. Yes. And it being left adrift financially, it percolates up through everything else, right? We're just, the culture goes awry, et cetera. And I think the bottom of it is this, that we live in a world of scarce resources. As we've said, we can resolve disputes over those resources where there is more demand for a thing than there is supply of a thing. We can resolve it one of two ways. And it's either contract, right? We have some property right or a dispute resolution mechanism, rule of law, contract law, all of these protocols for peacefully resolving the dispute according to fair rules, or via conflict, right? We can fight over it. And when you remove the option of contract, or you start to disintegrate contract, you inevitably push people into conflict. Like there's no other choice. It really is one of the two, right? Contract or conflict. So if you violate contract, well, you end up in conflict. Surprise, surprise. And I mean, I guess we could maybe kind of consider Bitcoin the reverse in a way. It's like it makes conflict so uneconomic because it's hard to, you can't break the property right in Bitcoin with conflict. So it kind of forces you into contract, which is a nice externality. But this other idea of the government having these, what are they, contingency clauses? I read this quote, I'll paraphrase. If you have a clause that gives government additional powers in a state of emergency, then that's only going to lead to the government creating emergencies to consolidate power. Obviously.
Yeah.